So I'd like to introduce our panel. Really good to get to know everyone here. We'll start with Suzanne McBride, and I'm going to ask each of them to give you their bio, basically. I think it's always fun to hear it in their own words. So Suzanne?
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. I have been in journalism since the early 1980s. My very first story was published in the now defunct Bettendorf, Iowa News. I have no idea now what it was about, and my mom's no longer here to remind me. I'm sure she remembers the story in great detail. And then my most recent publication was a few weeks ago. I'm a part-time editorial writer on the editorial board of the Chicago Sun-Times, and it was about crime in Chicago. So I have been in journalism a while, and I look forward to having a discussion with you, and I certainly look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason Piscia. I direct the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS here in town. PAR is a 10-month master's degree program that focuses on reporting on government and politics. Sort of the highlight for our students is they spend 6 months in the State House press room reporting on what the governor and the General Assembly are doing. So they're sort of on the front lines of all the good and horrible things that are happening in local media at the moment. I lived in Illinois my whole life. I went to Illinois State for my undergrad. Then I actually came here to UIS to get my master's degree in PAR 20-some years ago. Then went to work for the local newspaper, the State Journal-Register, in 1998, where my first story, on my very first day, a tornado hit Springfield. So I got thrown out and worked till midnight that night. So worked there for 21 years. I was an editor, helped with the website, ended my time there as the managing editor, sort of the day-to-day manager of what the newsroom did. Then I got hired here, and I've been here for the last 4 years. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. I'm Randy Eccles. I'm the general manager of NPR Illinois, which is the NPR network news outlet for NPR here in the Capitol. I also serve as the president of the Illinois Public Broadcasting Council, all the public TV and radio stations in the state of Illinois, and on the governor's local journalism task force, which was recently started, and we can talk some more about that later. I started in radio as a freshman in high school. My high school in the Chicago suburbs happened to have a 4-year radio program, and immediately we got to go out and cover the 1978 election, and I heard mentioned earlier Senator Percy, that's whose headquarters we got to go to, and that was an interesting experience for a young journalist to get to go and hang out with all the adults and be underage as they were drinking too. So it's been really interesting to work in Chicago at WGN Radio for many years, and also in Phoenix to see the differences in markets and how they approach covering news. I was born in Hinsdale, raised in the south suburbs, and have family out in the rural area of western Illinois, Forgotonia. And so I've gotten a good perspective on the city urban versus the rural. And now living here in Springfield, a small city, it also has some impact on the availability of journalism and how it gets executed. But let's get into questions. We'll save some time for questions at the end. So if you have any, we appreciate that. First of all, media's role in democracy. I mean, what effect do we have in our democracy right now? And Suzanne, let's start with you.
Well, we've always had an effect, and I think more so than ever, many more people are involved in creating journalism. So in the last 15 years, we've lost about half of the local news jobs across the country. It's tens of thousands of jobs. So on the one hand, we've lost trained journalists doing that kind of work, but what we've gained is anyone who basically has access to a cell phone or a computer and the internet can do journalistic work. Now you notice I will say they are not journalists, right? But they can do journalistic type work. Now I don't think our role in the media, those of us who are trained as journalists, has really changed, and we still play a very important watchdog role, especially at a very local level. I've been thinking about this in terms of library bans, for instance. It's local media who are largely covering that, but it's also like a mom who might have a blog. It might be special interest groups who are using the internet to also shape and create news. So I think the media still obviously has an effect, but even who actually makes up the media is a much broader group and rather unfiltered.
Yeah, and I would add, I think the way media has changed, there's a certain level of need for brand loyalty now. I think media have sort of set their stake in the ground, like I'm going to be the media for the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. And I think so many people are exposed to that dynamic of how they get their news. It's sort of rubbed off and has created a lot of the problems that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, for years we had papers of record and 3 national networks each night, and those really provided a sense of community and maybe agreed upon to some extent facts of what we were talking about. But now with the democratization, there's an overwhelming amount of information. So, media's role, at least established media's role, I think, is to try to provide some credibility and some gatekeeping still. But your role has changed because now you have to choose where you're going to get that information. Media provide participants in our democracy and government with lots of things that they need, but that's evolved since we've gone digital. From the old days of the newspapers I was just talking about, and now with all this, how do you see that evolution? Jason?
I think people are just overwhelmed by the number of sources that they're exposed to on a daily basis. It's in addition to the graduate students that I teach, I also teach an undergraduate intro to mass media class, lots of sophomores and juniors who, funny story, I did a unit the other day about the history of newspapers, and sort of the culminating assignment is they have to go out and find an actual print newspaper. And that's step 1 is usually enough to throw them off, where do I buy such a thing? Sadly, they're not for sale on our campus, so they have to venture out and go find a gas station, and they're back by the bathrooms, and it's a whole thing. So that exercise in itself just sort of indicates how the changes have happened. I'll make them write a reflection paper about how that experience was, and they will talk about how, oh wow, it was actually sort of a relaxing experience. There's a finite amount of information in that newspaper. Once I'm done reading it, I've read it and it's done. I'm pretty confident in the reliability of that information. It's down on paper. Just sort of the actual look and feel of what a newspaper seems to be more credible than other places, as opposed to just the constant fire hose of TikTok or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And I think that's the main change that we're dealing with.
Well, and I think also this idea that anyone can be a publisher. And I use that with a small p, not a capital P, because that doesn't necessarily mean any of these normal traditional gatekeeping functions are still happening. And while on the one hand I think that's very exciting, when we had 3 network news that we all turned into and had this common conversation about what we thought news was as a democracy, we don't really have that anymore, but what we do have is many more voices who were left out. You have many more people of color, you have many more women, you have LGBTQ community better represented. So I think there's a lot of pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it's that social media that's really changed how we do things. That's the first thing I do in the morning, as opposed to going out to my doorstep and getting the 4 papers that I still get delivered to my house. I'm the only one in the whole block that gets that many. Even before I go out to get those papers, what am I doing? I'm getting online to see what's happening on social media. And that's a huge change, but it's also driving this 24/7 news cycle even more. I mean, I feel like we're not at 24/7, we're like, by the minute. By the millisecond.
Always on, yeah. So are we as media providing the information that citizens need then as we've evolved?
I think we aspire to.
Yes.
The economic factors behind local media especially have made it more difficult.
Yeah.
We can get into discussions later about news deserts and ghost newspapers and the effect that has had and how it leads to the polarization of the world around us.
So,
well, at the end of the day, it costs money to produce news, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, if we could all go back in be time travelers and go back to that day, well, a couple days. One, we probably should have paid attention to Craigslist. That was a big mistake that we didn't do that. Classified and displayed ads was what was, making newspapers very profitable. Double digit, 20, 25% returns was very typical not too long ago. We didn't really pay attention to Craigslist. The other thing we didn't pay attention to is as soon as everything was put online, or a lot of our content for free, why would anyone pay for it? And really the only publications that have done well are places like the Wall Street Journal that they're highly niche. They largely have never put their content out for free, and they also have business people who can write off or have their businesses pay for that subscription. But I think there are a lot of lessons that those are two big lessons I wish we could undo.
Yeah, we made the mistake of training you that news is free by
Yeah.
giving away. We wanted the extra circulation and promotion, but
Yeah.
it ended up biting us in the end. I tell the story when I was at the Tribune, there was a person who was researching what the future would be digitally for news media, and every scenario that she ran came up as a no-win situation. There was not going to be a way that digital was going to generate enough money to continue journalism. And that's where we stand right now. I think we're facing a lot of loss of journalists, part of that reduction in half of the reporters out there, because the business model got disrupted. There's no more classifieds and things like that. And then also digital disruption of just getting the stuff for free. So that's made it hard. What positive or negative impacts of this free information are we encountering for people? I think, Suzanne, you said one of them, we're seeing many more people who didn't have a seat at the table being able
Right.
to get up and tell their stories.
Right.
Anything else that we're seeing as a positive coming out of the proliferation of digital media? Jason has the answer. I know.
Free speech is good, and I think the more voices that are out there, and I think you alluded to it, traditional mainstream journalism has maybe historically done a bad job of representing underrepresented groups. And I think we've rightly been called out on that a lot. And I think slowly but surely amends are being made in that area. Still a long way to go, but I think that's one way that's been opening our eyes.
Okay. So we talked earlier, I think it's incumbent now on you as the user to have media literacy. It's increasingly important to be able to evaluate the credibility of information. From your perspectives, what can a person do to identify and avoid misinformation? And when you see a lesser known community news site, not one of the big brands, how can you be comfortable with it?
Well, I know all of you probably know to look at the URL and see, is it edu, is it gov, what is it? And to look at the about section. You can learn a lot about how people present their websites. I think of Dan Proft and his newspapers that he put out. Also, there was some website information. If you do even basic Googling, let alone advanced Googling, as a consumer of general news and information, you can pretty quickly determine who some of these folks are. Now, increasingly, I think people have become more sophisticated, especially if they're interested in a particular point of view, and I would say that's the far right and the far left. I would never, that's a one or the other. And I think those are things that we really need to think about. And then they're very basic things that even my children, I have a 24-year-old and a 20-year-old, and I think they're generally decent consumers of information. My husband's also a journalist. But just making sure everyone in your sphere, have those conversations. How are you getting information? Then how are you actually verifying that information? And of course, there are websites like Snopes. I can't tell you how many times I see educated people on Facebook say, hey, and if they had Googled it for 2 seconds, they would have found it's a verified urban myth. And I'm really always taken back by how educated a lot of these people are, that they don't think to do that. So I feel probably even, as preschoolers and early education, we should be training even young people at that age, to just be discerning about what they're consuming.
Yeah, another quick story about my undergrad class. They're great kids. At the beginning of the semester, I asked them, what's your daily news diet? Where do you get your news? And I'm always surprised at the people who say Twitter or Facebook or TikTok, not discerning that there's many different sources that contribute to those websites. So I have to ask some more. What accounts on Facebook or TikTok? And then they'll get into some highly questionable things that are partisan or made by influencers and really don't have a basis in the mainstream news media that we can trust. So another lesson we do in that class is a media literacy unit where we just give some basic tips on lateral reading. If you're reading a story, you're not sure about something, or just open up another tab in your browser, do searches for keywords, and see what you can find out. There's also reading upstream, clicking links in the stories to kind of go back in time and sort of figure out the origin story of this information that made it in front of your face today, and doing the same tactics to figure out if that's legitimate or not.
Yeah, and it's not just students. All of us need media literacy. One of the unfortunate mistakes, once in a great while, I get reminded as I share something and I realize, you know what, let me double check that again. And then I'm going, oh, how do I retract that? Yeah, here we go. So, it's better not to have to go down that road and do it before you share. So that's good. Newspapers have had a history of being very partisan. We tend to think digital's partisan now, but I mean, newspapers had that history. How is it different now, though, between what we saw with, the great newspapers versus all this digital information?
Right. Well, I think one thing that's changed, not even just in the newspaper arena, but is in radio and TV. Think of back in the day when you didn't have cable news on all the time. That's a lot of time to fill. The 1 year I spent in TV, I was like, oh my God. Every day you had to fill a lot of time, and that's where you just get these talking heads and these pundits who increasingly are rewarded for certain types of very polarizing views. And so I think that's one thing. I don't know how to solve that, but it's really problematic. I don't know how you kind of undo that, Jeannie.
Yeah, when I worked at the Journal Register as a reporter, sort of the mid-2000s, our editor at the time, Barry Locker, would solicit for feedback about how we're doing on coverage, and people would mail us back like handwritten pieces of paper, a form, and he would hang the certain forms on the bulletin board for us to look at, and it was always amazing. Each time there'd be someone complaining about how we're totally in the bag for Republicans and how dare you support the Republican Party the way you do, and then right next to it, written about the same time, how dare you support Democrats the way you do. So a lot of that is, eye of the beholder stuff, where, people read what they want to read. And I think from a local media standpoint, I think we always ideally have the best interests of the community at heart, and we come at that angle. But now, today, media organizations are, brash in what they stand for and what parties they support, and, go out of their way to denigrate one and lift up the other. So I think that's the difference.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier the news cycle. It used to be a newspaper was put to bed and came out the next morning, and they had a full day to digest and analyze the news, double check their sources. Then with national TV, it was still about the 24-hour news cycle. Then we had full-time cable news, and it became nonstop. And then the internet just increased that even more every moment you're on. And that leaves less and less time for people to vet the information that's getting out to you, and puts more responsibility on yourselves. When I first learned the term gatekeeping, it was considered a negative term, that the big media companies would prevent some stories from getting out. But what we've learned, I think, more now is it's an opportunity for them to edit something and make sure it's credible and get out, because all the information can get out now. That's not the issue. It's just whether or not it's credible. There were newspapers and national networks of record, but gatekeeping information, how do people deal with that now? How do we know where to go for well-edited information?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think we in the media don't do a very good job of promoting. I was always interested in what the marketing folks were doing at our newspaper and our TV station. They would identify, okay, these are the people we want everyone to be paying attention to. And I think we have to do a much better job, I think, as media, identifying our experts and our sources and vetting them, and then making sure we're linking out to credible work that they're doing. I mean, that is one of the great things about being online. As Jason was saying, yes, you can check, when he has his students check the work. Well, that's also a way for any user of information to actually be able to confirm that this is legitimate. Just like think of how often you want to be cited as a scholar, right? Okay, as a news outlet, you want to be cited a lot by other outlets. You want to be mentioned in email newsletters. I've started to read my Illinois Politico this morning and got sidetracked, but there are legitimate newsletters that I read because I know who the people are behind them, and I appreciate how much they aggregate the news. I know that I'm not going to have time to read all this. What I'm worried about is people on both sides who are very polarizing, and groups that will start to be presenting information in that same type of way. I just go back to the Dan Prof newspaper. I mean, I had very informed neighbors, and like picking that up and asking me, like, "Oh, this looks legit." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?"
I heard
you know,
new
and then you
paper
would,
in town, right?
And you would walk through it, and they're like, "Oh, yeah." I mean, these are like, doctor, a lawyer in one case. I'm like, "Oh my gosh." So that, I think that whatever we can do, like, I take my job very seriously. Yes, I'm a journalist, but I'm also like an engaged citizen of the world, and that means it's incumbent upon me, anyone near me, encouraging them to use legitimate sources, to evaluate sources, just to be a good critical thinker.
And it doesn't help that social media rewards stories, topics, things that are popular but not important. A silly story can go viral, and then when my students check their social media
But I
feeds,
really care about Taylor Swift and the Jets now.
everyone loves the Taylor Swift and the Chiefs now. But yeah, it's that's very popular. In the end, it's not important. And I would go as far to say, even on a national political basis, I mean, yes, it's historic that the House Speaker has been thrown out of office, but in the grand scheme of, why does government exist? It exists to make America better. Is doing that working toward that goal? That answer is no.
Yeah.
And I think the media pays way too much attention to the sideshows and the circus and the Matt Gaetzes of the world who are in there to make a name for himself, instead of, they're more interested in self-promotion than they are governance. And I think, it's easy for media to sort of shine a light at that because it's crazy and everyone will look at it and click on it. And we've sort of lost that emphasis on what's important.
Yeah.
Suzanne was mentioning credible sources and how important that is to find good sources. NPR, though, has also had slightly the opposite over the past few years, trying to emphasize finding diverse sources, people who aren't always being heard and going out. So one of the things the network has done is help provide, and we all contribute to it, new people who might be good sources on things, especially who might not be the usual suspects. And so both of those are important, finding people who are credible, but also finding people you might not usually hear from. How are we as media playing into the polarization?
Oh, sadly, I think we do it all the time. It's almost like we can't help ourselves. Just going back to the Taylor Swift story for a moment, like I think of, wow, if we could employ Taylor Swift and Beyonce like in a media literacy campaign, get them to do certain things on their channels. I feel like it's very hard for us to stay focused on the important process of local government, state government, federal government. It's really important for, and look, how much attention we pay to polls. I was a former political reporter whose husband covered the 88 and 92 presidential campaigns. Like I grew up in Iowa. I went to Iowa caucuses as a kid. I'm super interested in all that. But at the end of the day, taking that, even if it's a legitimate poll, and we've given all the methodology as you should, at the end of the day, what does that tell us? I'm not saying we shouldn't be covering, Trump ahead by 30 percentage points, but when we spend our limited resources on a limited reporting staff across the board on things like that, it comes at the expense of actually delving into issues, following up on things. I'm amazed at how little, even 30 years ago, we covered in state government. We didn't even have a full-time, courts reporter. Think of what happens when laws are passed and then rules and regulations are promulgated, and then things get challenged. There's so many things that affect everyday people that's where we should be spending all our time, rather than, as Gannett just put out an ad for a Beyonce reporter and a Taylor Swift reporter. I'm not saying don't do those things, but really what we should be doing is a lot more of the more boring government coverage that really impacts people way more than Taylor Swift or Beyonce.
And if you think about it in the context of how political debates are staged and covered, debates are no longer debates.
No.
It's people looking for a 3-second soundbite that'll go on television and become viral. If we think back to the Republican candidate debate from a few weeks ago, the one in California, what's the one thing we all remember from that debate?
Yeah, I think what we've also heard a
Donald
bit
Duck.
about.
The Donald Duck statement, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I like Nikki Haley saying, "You make me dumber every time I listen to you."
So, but those are the comments that get
Right.
attention and really don't add anything to the discourse.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard news fatigue, and I think that's a big part of polarization. The more people tune out of news and tune into Taylor Swift, the less informed they are, and the more people can get away with whatever they don't want to be accountable for. That's been very difficult. There have been a couple people in the news industry who've talked about how we should be approaching coverage to avoid that, and solutions journalism is one of the terms that's been thrown out there. Is don't just put the doom and gloom out there, but what can you do to right the situation? What is the option to move forward? So that's one possibility. In general, though, we're seeing the collapse of the journalism business models we talked about earlier with classifieds and everything else. We talk about how clickbait or getting people to go to websites to try to get as much traffic as possible will hopefully bring in revenue. Only the biggest websites out there are making a significant amount of money. And we're talking Google, Facebook, not as much. I mean, I'm sure the New York Times and Washington Post have figured it out. But after that, I think it's getting, at least from what we're hearing, a lot of papers aren't making significant dollars on their digital side.
No.
So how do they pay for their journalism? Where do we go to continue journalism?
Well, the Chicago Sun-Times, where I work part-time, used to be for-profit for many, many decades, went through a lot of ownership changes at a number of points. My husband and I are like, gosh, because he works full-time at the Sun-Times. I'm glad that, Suzanne has a job as well outside at the Sun-Times because it could go down at any moment. And now we're a nonprofit because we joined up with WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio. And that has given us a level of security that we haven't had in decades. Now, I'm not saying every, news outlet should become a nonprofit, but I think that's a model that increasingly people are exploring. I spent about 5-6 months in Ireland on a Fulbright and spent a little bit of time in the UK. Was super interested in the BBC and how they are funded. I don't know if any of you know that, but there is a long-standing tax on every TV you own in the UK, and that largely gets channeled back into BBC. Think if we had a tax at the state level, I'm guessing be more likely perhaps at the federal level, of every cell phone, and that somehow got funneled back into local news. 10, 15 years ago, most of us as journalists have been pretty uncomfortable about that discussion because when you have this idea of government funding you in any way, that makes many of us rightly uncomfortable. But I think we're at a very different state now, and I think there are guardrails you can put up. And if we think that is a valuable commodity, just like we need our gas and electric provided, I think the things we should explore.
Yeah, and I see lots of growth potential in the nonprofit sector as well. If you're a news consumer in Illinois, you probably have heard about Capital News Illinois, which is the nonprofit organization that has a bureau at the State House, and they just cover the State House news all day long and provide that coverage for free to member newspapers, just filling in that gap that's been left behind by the for-profit media organizations that have pulled their correspondents out of Springfield.
And it's non-competitive, right? Anybody can pick it up.
Yep.
Yeah.
As opposed to competitive journalism where you're trying to break something before someone else. Now we're at the point where it's more important just to get the information out.
But the problem with the fundamentals in general is grant money typically starts that. And if any of you have ever gone out after foundation dollars, if you get it for 3 years, that's great. You're not likely to get it for longer. I started a local news website and got 2 rounds of funding, and then I'm kind of on my own. Now I have a college infrastructure behind me, so I can get student reporters paid that way. But I can't scale up to the degree that I would like. And so I think the other thing we really have to think about is how much are any of us, like micropayments at one point, that was being explored. We don't really talk about that anymore, but I think we just have to find a lot of different ways that we can support news across the board, and then have a really good, Beyonce, Taylor Swift campaign to get everyone paid for this.
There's been some discussion on the local journalism task force about tax rewards and stuff, so that if you hire journalists, you get some payroll tax deduction or things like that. That may help, but I don't think it's going to help enough. We're looking more and more at foundations really getting into funding. There's a new, and the Community Foundation for the Land of Lincoln here just participated in the announcement of Press Forward along with the McCormick and Joyce Foundations as a major initiative. The funders are now seeing that it's a crisis in journalism, and if we're going to stay informed, there has to be some way of paying for it. So they're starting to step forward,
Yeah.
but the problem is, again, it's not sustainable.
Right.
It's an initial launch, and a lot of times the idea is to start something shiny and new,
Yeah.
where what we need right now is to keep going what we've got going a lot of times. The other aspect I think we're finding is students are figuring this out, and they're starting to go, I'm not sure journalism is what I want to go into. They've seen journalists come under attack as they're
Yeah.
out covering stories,
Yeah.
and they're hearing that they don't make that much money. And so
Yeah.
you both teach students. How do we keep students enthused about this career
Yeah.
field?
I mean, the low money and the lack of respect has been the case forever. I mean, it's not a new thing.
Although I think the
definitely
idea of
gotten
being
worse.
threatened, like I don't remember in my 80s and 90s being, physically threatened, and certainly not threatened on the internet. And I think that's I mean, I have so many students who were initially interested and they're like, nope, I'm not going to do that. Like, I don't, even more so I think than the money, that they're like, I don't want to be out there, especially if you're a female, the amount of trolling. I mean, I'm thankful that I write editorials that are not that have not carry my byline, because it's amazing. If you touch on anything about crime, I mean, it's a nasty cesspool out there.
Yeah. That said, I think, with the nonprofit money sort of flowing in, there is a momentum toward funding, recognizing that there is a problem in local news, and a momentum toward outside people wanting to make it better. I think that gives students some encouragement. In the loss of interest in journalism, it's affected my program too. 20 years ago we had 60 people apply for 20 spots, and now I'm getting 15 students to apply for 12 spots.
Yeah.
So the numbers are different. So as a result, I've expanded my recruiting tactics, not just to look at people who did undergrad work in journalism. I'm be surprised to find there's people in a lot of other disciplines who are passionate about making things better and doing the things that journalists do on a daily basis, letting people know about things. So I'm finding students in political science, psychology, social work, history, criminal justice, business, those sorts of industries where there's important issues going on, and they can apply their expertise in those areas into a career in journalism.
What advice are you giving your young reporters on how to deal with social media?
Don't read it.
Yeah.
So many of them are part
Only
of
with
X,
a
though.
stiff drink and only at certain points, and then you go out and do something totally different. Yeah, it is really hard because you do want, reader feedback. Like I remember back in the day, reader feedback was someone writing a letter to the editor, right? And then the news side, they would show it to you sometimes, even before it ran in the paper, or someone would actually pick up the phone and call you and talk to you. So in some ways, I do think like we get a lot more feedback via email, which I think is helpful. But I don't know how you begin to. This is a larger societal issue. Like, how do you deal with people who just aren't good civic citizens? Who are just and they may not be nasty people. I don't want to demonize people, but their tactics, and they feel very comfortable through anonymous, email or a social media channel. Just, I mean, really, would you say that with your mom standing there? Would you say that if you and I were actually face to face looking at each other? I don't know how you begin to deal with that. There have been some interesting movements. Some public radio stations out west and on the East Coast as well, going back a few years now, have been deliberately identifying, not necessarily even listeners, but non-listeners who are, on different sides of the spectrum politically, and bringing them together over time, often over meals, to have conversations about very specific topics, often very local, important issues. And I don't know if any of those efforts have been sustained over time, but those are the kind of dialogues that we need to be having. And I think that's one exciting thing that we've seen along traditional media, really seeing their job as not just putting the news information out there, like, here, I'm giving you my information, but more of a two-way interactive situation where you have some more give and take. And I think we in the media have a really important role to play, and we should be playing it even more actively to actually engage different groups of people and actively get them to talk to each other, and for us to be able to amplify some of those conversations.
And in terms of encouraging people to get into the business, I mean, one thing I mentioned to a lot of them, especially now, if we think about like the development of how information goes. Social media started in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006. students coming into the end of their college time now have lived with it their entire life, their entire formative years. There's still a significant level of leadership in the news industry who maybe just can't get over the fact that no one likes to read newspapers anymore and feel really upset that the newspaper now publishes only 2 days a week. The upcoming generation of news leaders have never picked up a newspaper. They understand how news is consumed and what needs to be done for more people to consume it. So I think there's an exciting opportunity there for those, digital natives to sort of set the standard on how we go forward.
Do you think we'll see more of them start their own news sites, much like digital influencers, YouTube type folks? Mm-hmm. They'll get some journalism training and then put it to work and see if they can actually make a living?
Yeah, I do think we'll see more of that. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So as social media has increased, it's also isolated all of us in different ways. We're finding more and more, and the pandemic helped with this quite a bit, but we're finding that we don't get out and socialize as much. A lot of times this clicking is what we think we're doing to socialize with our friends and family. That also has created a problem for engagement and the creation of community in our individual cities. So coverage deserts have started up, but not just news coverage, also engagement coverage type deserts. How do we deal with what was originally more a rural problem? If you go out to a smaller city out here in Illinois, there was no longer a local paper at all. But now we've got it so even small cities like Springfield, where Gannett, in the paper here, has declined to the extent that there's not much news there local at all. Yeah. And they're not out in the community doing things like they used to be. How do we overcome these deserts?
Well, I think we're more open to people who aren't, traditionally trained journalists, like spreading the word, looking for information. Some of the best stories I've seen going back many, many years are people who just shared things that are happening with them, their lives on Facebook. Now, is that really a story that I'm going to put in a newspaper? Maybe not. But even think of how we're using social media in the last, 48 to 72 hours with what's happening in the Middle East. How are we finding out, how is the world finding out how people are greatly impacted there? We're, of course, trying to find Chicagoans, right, who are stuck abroad and trying to get back. Those are all ways that, okay, they're not really traditional news stories. I'm not going to open my newspaper up the next day and basically see all them, but I think we as journalists have to figure out a way to curate more of that material and figure out how to share that more broadly and really think of ourselves as being engaged in these larger conversations and not just being the traditional gatekeeper. I think that's easier said than done.
Yeah, when it comes to, I train students to cover government, and I think journalists are horribly outnumbered when it comes to journalists versus the press handlers who are forcing a message about a politician's stance down our throat. And it's easy on those days when we're really busy to just rewrite the press release for exactly what they want us to say. So I think, I always tell my students, we talk a lot about how Illinois government works, how a bill becomes a law. I gave a test about those things yesterday. One of my students is out here. She's traumatized a bit by that test, but you did okay. You did good. But I always tell them it's important to know the process, but don't forget about the people. Yeah. All the legislation that's being dealt with affects regular people. So don't get caught up in the nuts and bolts and the turns of the screw about how the process works. Tell us the story about the farmer or the single mother or the crime victim and how this bill will help them or hurt them.
And a lot of those journalists have gone on to become PR flacks to double their money. So we see in the Capitol a lot of journalists, you can only make so much and then you can do much better working for a state agency as their communications.
We call it going to the dark side.
That's right. So it's, I think from our standpoint on NPR, the way we're starting to look at, and it's in the early stages right now, is there's just no way we're ever going to get enough reporters to address the news deserts. And so we're reaching out and doing some things we're seeing in other places, like in Chicago, there's Block Club Chicago, or you've got a couple of organizations that you've put together, and it's to try to identify people in the community who are interested in telling about their community, and then providing them with some training so it can be journalistic, and an editor back at our place that can take what they give us and then get it out about their community. So we're in the early phases. That's easier said than done, as Jason mentioned, but that seems to be one of the possibilities is getting, as we democratize journalism, get them to help amplify it more that way.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the City Bureau model. Were started by 4 young people, one of whom was a former student of mine. City Bureau's now expanded to Detroit and a couple other places with pretty major funding. I think MacArthur's given them a little bit of funding as well. And they do a few things, really interesting things where they basically go out and teach everyday people, particularly in South and West Side neighborhoods of Chicago that have even less coverage in general about their communities, to document like local, police meetings, local school council meetings. And they're not being trained necessarily to write a story per se, but to actually go out, be at a meeting that might be at other anyway, and then they can write up these notes. The other thing I think we have to really think more broadly about as journalists is there's a lot of different ways to tell a story. It's not just like a 500-word story with a couple of photos, which is a great way to tell a story. It's not just a 1.5 minute TV or radio bit. You actually, maybe it's just a Q&A. Maybe it's just a bunch of bullet points. There are lots of different ways that we can communicate, or an infographic. So I think that's really exciting, some of those efforts.
Yeah, different ways help a lot. We're going to get to some questions here, but a couple last questions quickly. What tools exist to help us deal with partisanship, polarization? I think one of them I remember seeing is the AdFonts Media Biz chart. Do you feel that's pretty accurate? I know there's been some question about it. If you haven't seen it, it's a giant chart, and it lists the center and depth at the top and surface stuff at the bottom, and it populates different media all throughout it through research. So you can look and you can see NPR is pretty much in the center, maybe just a touch left of center. Most of our established news media that sometimes are portrayed as far left are actually in the center. And then there are some real left stuff and some real right stuff. But it helps when you're trying to figure out, is this credible, to take a look at that chart if you ever have the chance. I think you mentioned Snopes is one of the places.
Yeah, Snopes. If you don't know about that, make sure your grandma and your auntie have it too. So they don't keep sharing those same crazy stories with you.
And then the last piece that I think we discussed and getting ready for this is make sure you can identify the difference between news and punditry, especially on the cable news networks. There's bits of news surrounded by lots of opinion. And so that comes across, when I was in radio back in Chicago, I remember we did perceptual research, and people thought that Rush Limbaugh was a fantastic journalist. But, the journalism was the newscast, and during his show, he was doing, something completely different. So, well, I think you'll want to get to questions. There may be some questions out on the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a big picture question.
Yeah.
But, as we discuss this, it seems to me it's a supply and demand issue, right? And on the supply side, Jason and I have been at a conference talking about sort of the success of some nonprofit organizations like the Texas Tribune happens to come to mind, right? And again, replicated with, I guess, your merger and other places. I guess, though, what do we do on the demand side? In other words, how do we create or somehow foster the appetite for wanting to have balanced news? In my classrooms, it used to be easy to say what you read in the New York Times will not be what you read in the Wall Street Journal, and to have sort of a pretty simplistic dialogue about the differences. These days, it is just so mix and match, whether it's commentary or real news. So the question for me is, what do we do on, again, the supply, on the demand side? In other words, to generate the ability of citizens to want to have balanced, I guess, to say that, but news or information.
Well, and not just to have balanced news, but then be interested in having a formal or informal place to come together as a community, whether it's in person or online, to like discuss some of these basic things. I mean, to me, it's like that's really lacking, and I think there are lots of groups that actually should be involved in that. Like, that shouldn't just be media outlets, they should be involved in that. But like, what's the local Chamber of Commerce doing? What's the local PTA doing? Like, are there ways that groups day in and day out can work with the media and the media work with them and bring together people on a regular basis to have those conversations? Because to me, that would actually create an increased demand for balanced news. I will say, since I've had friends who both worked at the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, some of them, especially at the Wall Street Journal, can be very frustrated by, people still not understanding. And that comes back to media, about the difference between like the Wall Street Journal's op-ed and editorial page, and then what their DC, bureau folks do. Like, those are two very different things. You've seen it with the Sam Alito coverage. I don't know if you've been following that, but the Wall Street Journal has gotten him the editorial page. Like, he's been regularly interviewed, like basically defending himself, and some of the, and Clarence Thomas as well. It's super interesting, but you have to be a very sophisticated reader to see what's going on there. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be reading both those, but those are two very different things in one news outlet. So sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, like, how do we even begin to explain that to people?
Go ahead. Sorry. I'm fine.
Go ahead.
So I had a question about one of the other, I guess, routes that have been seen, I guess, as one of the solutions to the decline in local journalism, in terms of thinking about local TV. This came back because a student did a project on this, but looking at the kind of conglomerates, wherever, like Sinclair or Gray's, in
Yeah.
terms of it's local news, but it's, a nationalized brand, and, she did some interesting, content analysis of
Yeah.
watching the same, like picking cities and they had one output of each, and looking at what was the difference in coverage, and really seeing how the nationalized focus of politics and the, more left-leaning Grays and the right-leaning Sinclairs,
Yep.
shaped that narrative. And so, I guess, how do you see that as kind of the pros and cons of something where, yes, you still have a local outlet, technically, but it's not really built up of people who are on the ground interviewing people in the community. It's instead, three-quarter stories,
Yeah.
that are the national stories, made by departmental
Yeah.
organizations.
Well, money drives everything, right? Like, my best friend just retired after like almost 40 years in local TV news, mostly in the Midwest, but has worked on the West Coast too. And she was a government reporter, and she got so frustrated by how many, like, oh, that's not a story, that's not a story. Like, increasingly, a lot of these stations are doing, like, they didn't want her to do a local story because they could just take the story that, some Sinclair station in West Virginia had done, and then they would put her on a crime story. Because, TV news has gotten the internet game well before everyone else did. Because if you have 3 or 4 stations, even in a small market competing, there's always been this high-level competition. And they weren't looking for clicks back in the day. They were looking for eyeballs through Nielsen. And so I think, I don't know how you begin to deal with the TV consolidation and conglomerates, because that, I don't know how you stop that trend, other than if you're going to really better fund and people like give to their local PBS stations, honestly, like, and Access TV. Like, that to me is where you could actually start to do a little bit of, those are actually alternative news sources that generally, not always, but generally can offer more balanced news and more local news that's specific to that community and not in 18 other markets.
Yeah, being biased toward public media, the fundraising aspect really gives us a lot of freedom. The fact is, the biggest stream of support for most PBS and NPR stations is the donations that come from the public, and they're small donations, so it's not like somebody can threaten you that they're going to pull their donation
Yeah.
and you're going to change your coverage
Yeah.
because of that. So things, at the PBS level, you've got some really good in-depth and documentary work like Frontline and Nova and different things, and the NewsHour, and then NPR is much bigger on making sure they have international and national stories covered. And then the local stations have the opportunity to step up. I would say, in general, radio is stepping up more at the local level to cover things than TV. TV will do some more entertainment, arts and entertainment type stuff locally at times. But it's really important to support that, and that's that funding thing. And it goes back to what you talk about with Sinclair and the different TV groups, they are also suffering from a lack of funding. The advertising market is contracting. Disney's CEO just said recently he's considering getting rid of the television stations. And so there are people looking at buying those. So the funding of journalism is going to be really important. Way in the back, at the very back. Go ahead.
Hi, I am teaching public management, and one of the things that we were talking about is that the private sector, like the companies, they have public relations to tell the, the customer what we are doing and everything. So for the public agency, I mean, I have a question that what do you guys as a journalist and, the media people think in terms of educating the public, like, what is the daily operation, like day to day? How do we provide a smooth road, public management things to the citizen?
If I'm hearing the question correctly, it's how do we help provide a citizen's more day-to-day operational ability for media? Well, one, buy it if you can. I mean, I think the newspapers would still say that, although it may be a little past that time for them. But use credible media, support it, share it. If you haven't picked one or two credible sources to buy access to, a good internet account, or support your public media station, that type of stuff can be really helpful. And I think the other part we talked about is engagement. Push back. If you hear something that doesn't sound right, we need to hear that, because if we don't hear that, then we may not get the opportunity to make sure it's correct.
I'm actually in charge of the timekeeping, and I'm afraid there are hands in the air, but we're out of time. But we have an hour for lunch, so I encourage you to congregate at lunch to ask questions of the panelists, and maybe you can.
Just real quick, thank you to Suzanne McBride and Jason Piscia. I'm Randy Eccles. We really appreciate you coming out to listen.
Good job.
Thank you.